So this week's lecture is on the subjects of race, ethnicity, and nationality. So we're really looking here at a set of identities that are in some ways quite similar to other kinds of identities we've looked at in the past. For example, we already talked about gender identity and the ways that biology and culture get sort of tangled together in how people think of those categories and think of those identities. So you'll see that same theme when we talk about race, ethnicity, and nationality, that all of them include elements that people tend to think of as being based in nature or based in biology, but actually these are socially constructed categories and identities. The reading you did for this week in the Perspectives book, one of the interesting things that the author talks about is how people have responded to his own identity as somebody whose racial or ethnic identity is not often clear to other people, and he describes getting questions like, "Dude, what are you?" So one of the things that he's demonstrating there, and I think we've probably all experienced this in one way or another, is that people are interested in who and quote-unquote what one is. So that is to say that all of us both have identities projected onto us, and we often embrace identities that we use to make sense of who we are and how we fit into the world. So these are really important elements of both individual lives and of the societies that we're a part of. One of the most important issues that I want you to take on board from this lecture and from what you're reading for this week is the idea of social construction, okay? And that's really a lot of what we're talking about in this course in general. But in this case, for this week's topics, we're really talking about how these categories come to be taken for granted, even though they are, in fact, things that people make up, okay? So I'm not saying they're imaginary, right? These are real categories and real identities that have real consequences in the world. But we want to make sure we understand these categories as socially constructed. That is, they are the result of social processes over time, okay? So the categories and identities that we understand to be race are some of those socially constructed categories. One of the ways that we know that, or that we can see that in action, is that if we look across the world, right, we look at how race is understood in different places, and if we look across time, that is how race is understood in the past versus in the present, we can see that race categories and identities are variable. So that is to say that people in different parts of the world have different understandings of what race does or doesn't mean, and what the nature of those categories are. And also, people understand race in different ways over time, right? Those categories change. They've changed in the United States, for example, which we'll talk about later in this lecture. So that the shifting nature of race categories and identities is an indicator that there is something socially constructed. Okay, this is not just a neutral, acultural, biological set of categories. Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit more, that idea, and we're going to talk about both race and ethnicity, which are related issues. As you read in the Perspectives chapter, there has been a real sort of fixation on classifying racial categories. There was across the 20th century, and really before that as well. But the book really focuses on the various attempts in the 20th century of both legitimate scientists and what I'm going to call pseudoscientists, right? People who are not actually using the scientific method, to classify people into groups, okay? And some of the results of some of that classification are some of the race categories that we use today, okay? So again, what I want to demonstrate in talking about this is why it is, or how it is that we can tell that that is a social process and not one rooted in nature. One of the ways to see that is to think about all the different sorts of variation that we see in human beings, okay? Race and ethnicity tend to be premised on particular kinds of human variation. For example, race is often connected to the issue of skin color, right? So if we look across all the different kinds of variation we see among human beings, there's a lot more than just that, right? Skin color is only one element of variability that we see in human beings. But it is one that tends to be culturally elaborated, right? There's a lot of attention given to the issue of skin color in identifying people around these questions of race and ethnicity. If we look at some of the other traits, we see that they're either ignored or they're analyzed in really different ways. So again, this is a signal to us that there's something social going on here. The fact that we focus on some elements of human variation and we completely ignore others, that's not a question of nature, that's a question of culture, okay? The book points out a couple of examples of those other sorts of variation that, for the most part, are not culturally elaborated. So, for example, lactose tolerance and intolerance, right, is one kind of human variation, right? As you read, there are some folks in the world who are able to digest milk and others who are not. In fact, it's more common to be lactose intolerant, to not be able to consume milk as an adult. These are the results of evolutionary processes, okay? So people who are able to digest milk in adulthood are the descendants of people who, for whom dairy products were a major part of the diet, right? So, for example, people who used animal husbandry, right? Raising animals that produced milk as a major part of how they subsisted, right? So these dairy products were a major part of the diet, right? So that had an evolutionary effect over time, and so you see that variation in people. Some people can digest milk in adulthood, lots of people cannot. We do not culturally elaborate that. You may very well know folks in your life who can or can't drink milk, but we do not consider those people to be different kinds of identities or different kinds of socially significant distinctions, right? Another example along the same lines is fingerprints. The fact is, all human fingerprints fall into three categories, which I have down here on the bottom of the slide. Loops, whorls, and arches. So you're one of these three. Everybody, all of you. And if you don't know, you can look at your fingerprints and figure out which one you are, right? I would guess that the majority of you listening to this don't know which one you are. And even if you did, you wouldn't somehow then feel some sense of connection to the other people with, for example, all the whorls don't feel some connection or some sense of being part of a socially significant group. We don't divide people up by loops, whorls, and arches, right? You might say, well, that's because we can't really see it that readily. It's on the tips of the fingers. But the fact is, it's arbitrary that human beings do focus on certain elements of human physical variation and completely ignore others. Okay, so again, a sign to us that this is a socially constructed set of processes. Along the same lines, the other thing we might note when looking at human physical variation is that a lot of the traits that we see in humans are continuous. That is, they don't fall out into one of a few groups. So fingerprints, actually there are three kinds, right? There are some groups there. But a lot of other human traits don't have that same sort of division, right? In other words, when we say that a human trait is continuous, it means it's along a continuum, right? So from one end of the continuum to the other, but there are no obvious or natural breaks in that continuum. So an example of that is human height, right? So in this top image, we know, and you know from just living around lots of other humans, that some people are shorter than others, right? And some people are taller than others. And what we see, if we were to line, all the people in the world up next to each other from shortest to tallest, is that there would be a continuum there, right? So there's every little sort of tiny gradation of difference in height from shorter to taller, right? So in other words, people do not fall out into three groups: the short people, the medium people, and the tall people. It's all relative, right? There's no clear dividing line. We could put some sort of arbitrary dividing lines like in this diagram, right? But I think all of us would agree that it's pretty random to put this, to make the distinction between the short people and the medium people right here. I could think it's over here, right? Or I could think it's over here. And in general, we don't make that distinction, right? So skin tone also is a continuous trait. People do not fall into 3 or 5 categories. The fact is, we see across humans every little gradation of variation in skin tone from lighter to darker, right? So as you see in this image on the bottom, right, there are no clear categories between light, medium, and dark. There is a gradation, right? So again, just as it's arbitrary to put these lines in around human height, it's also arbitrary to divide up people along that continuum of skin color, right? And yet we do. So again, the point here is that those are still very important processes for us to pay attention to, but we need to understand those processes for what they are. Those distinctions and those placing of people into different race or ethnic categories, those are sociocultural processes. Those are not natural. They are not based in biology. If we want to think about where those ideas came from then, I think we can look at some historical elements that inform the ways that particularly people in the contemporary U.S. think about race. Each society sort of has its own way of imagining race and ethnicity. In the U.S., I think some of the major antecedents to the concepts that are dominant here, and when I say antecedent, I mean these are the things that came before that have influenced the way that race is understood in the United States today, right? And there's a few things I want to point out that I think are some of the historical elements that have contributed to the American sort of cultural model of race, all right? So the first one is European colonialism. As I'm sure you all have encountered in some of the classes you took in high school and some of the ones you're taking now at Northeastern, the European nations, starting in the 16th century and extending in some parts of the world into the 20th century, traveled to various parts of the world and colonized other regions, meaning that they established governments there, and usually for the purpose of exploiting both the natural and the human resources in those places, right? So this was a set of acts of political and economic and human dominance, okay? But one of the things that created, particularly amongst Europeans and the descendants of Europeans, is this notion of a hierarchy of civilizations, right? In order to colonize other parts of the world, the European countries needed to come up with a way to justify that, right? There really is no justification for going to another part of the world and taking people's possessions, their natural resources, their land, killing them in large numbers, et cetera, et cetera. There is no justification for that. But what emerged from this process was this set of assumptions about civilization and about some people being more civilized than others, okay? So the root of a lot of ideas about race, and frankly the roots of a lot of contemporary racism, can be traced back to colonialism and its long period of juxtaposing some societies to others along this idea of a hierarchy of more advanced or more worthy societies versus others. One of the related historical phenomena to colonialism was, of course, the transatlantic slave trade, wherein, again, European powers, as part of the colonization process, took people from the continent of Africa, enslaved them, and brought them to various parts of the Americas to serve as labor for money-making ventures for those Europeans, right? This is the basis of certainly the slavery that buttressed the growth of the United States, right, in North America. Slaves, African slaves, were also taken to the rest of the Americas. So that very long process, the transatlantic slave trade, which again overlapped with the process of colonialism, of European colonialism from the 16th to the 19th century, also has a legacy in the way that we categorize race and the way that we think about race and the hierarchies that are the basis for racism. Okay, so again, this is in the historical past, but I think it's important for us to reflect on the fact that these very intense and important elements of our shared history have come to be part of the lens through which all of us look at the world, including through or including about these issues of identity, right? And identity particularly tied to questions of race and ethnicity. So this is another antecedent to contemporary U.S. Ideas about identity. Moving a little bit sort of later historically, at the same time that we had those colonial processes going on, we also had the rise in particularly the 18th and 19th centuries of scientific or pseudoscientific concerns with race. And your book, The Perspectives chapter, touches on this. Some of those studies during this period that attempted to categorize people from different parts of the world in terms of a presumed relationship between the physical form of people's bodies and their intelligence or the sophistication of their cultures, or indeed their place in a hierarchy of civilizations. Again, I call it pseudoscience because the fact is there's no validity to any of this. This is illegitimate thinking. It's not based in actual scientific findings. This is biased thinking, and it's really part of a racist ideology, right? So we can dismiss it as not being good information, but I do think we want to reflect on it because this was a long period where what was understood as science at the time contributed significantly to, again, those ideas about racial and ethnic identities. And these are some ideas that continue in a slightly different form, but continue to have an influence in the present. If we think about, again, the legacies of some of the very troubling chapters of the past in Europe and the U.S. that still inform ideas about race and ethnicity today, we'd also have to talk about the eugenics movement, which was a movement in both Europe and the U.S. starting in the late 19th century and stretching well into the 20th century, which was again, an idea about the relative worth, value, sophistication, civilization of different populations of people, right? It was, again, an idea that was steeped in a racist ideology about human variation, but that had a powerful effect, particularly in the politics of Europe and the U.S. during this period. And we'd have to also talk about things like the local laws, even in the United States, that lasted well into the 20th century, laws that kept people of different racial and ethnic identities segregated from one another in the period after the end of slavery. Many of you, I'm sure, have encountered this history in history classes and other classes that you've taken. The fact is, the end of slavery in the United States did not end segregation and racism, right? In fact, it continued very explicitly in the form of what are often referred to as the Jim Crow laws, wherein white people and non-white people were separated in all kinds of public places. So again, those specific laws eventually went away, but their legacy continues in the way that we understand who people are. So again, these are some of those precedents for these ideas about identity. One final example I'll give you is from the continent of Africa, where, again, ideas about the hierarchy of civilizations led the white settler regime in the southern African country of Zimbabwe to, in fact, deny that it was Africans who built some of the most astounding ruins that we find on the African continent. This is a picture of the ruins called Great Zimbabwe. This was the capital city of a large civilization that ran from about 1250 to 1450. So these magnificent buildings, which were constructed in that ancient society, that are still on the landscape today, clearly are the work of the Africans who lived in that region at that time. Again, the denials of the African origins of Great Zimbabwe were part of the politics of the settlers there until well into the 1960s. So, in other words, we see examples around the world of the sort of construction of both racial identities and the racism that creates a hierarchy of relative worth across different human populations. Now, this is, what I've been talking about so far is really sort of as a way of providing some background and connecting to your readings for this week in terms of where anthropology then comes into the story. And one of the best places to start with where anthropology comes into the story in the study of race and ethnicity is with the figure of Franz Boas, who was an American anthropologist who started his work at the turn of the 20th century, so very early, near the beginning of the discipline. By many, he's considered sort of the founder of modern American anthropology. And he, from those earliest days of his work, he rejected a lot of the sort of biology-based explanations of that era. He believed that human variations were cultural in nature, that for the most part those differences were in human behavior, not in human biology. And as part of that approach, he is one of the first anthropologists to develop the idea of cultural relativism, which we've talked about in here, right? In other words, that all human societies are equally sophisticated and complex and worthy of study, that no group of people is better than any other, or more advanced or more civilized or any of that, right? So Boas was a very important influence in the development of the field of anthropology as one that has always challenged those racist ideologies about human variability. That commitment has continued across the history of anthropology. So if Boas back at the turn of the 20th century was talking about cultural relativism, we see some of those same ideas embedded even in the current statement on race that is held by the American Anthropological Association, which is the major professional organization of anthropologists. So that statement says, in part, physical variations in the human species have no meaning except the social ones that humans put on them, right? So again, race is a social construction, not biology. Now, an important caveat to that is that saying that race is not biological that it is not based in biology, doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? What it means is that in order to understand its existence, we need to understand that it's a social phenomenon and not a biological one, okay? Race is a deeply felt social ideology that influences the lives of everyone in one way or another. So it's not to erase it or to say that it's not there. It's to say that we need to understand the nature of race in order to address it, in order to investigate it. As I said, one of the key ways we can understand the constructedness of race is to look at its variability, the ways that those categories change over time, and the ways that they change or vary across places in the world. Your book notes that even if we look at race categories in the U.S., we can see how those categories have changed over time. The book uses, for example, the category of whiteness, right? That what it meant to be white early in the 20th century is not the same as what it has come to mean to be white later on, right? That there were all kinds of distinctions among people that today we would consider white, but were not considered white. So during, for example, early 20th century periods of heavy immigration from Europe. So again, this is to point out that it's not a set of categories we can take for granted. Instead, we need to trace out where those ideas come from and how they shift across the eras. Now, one place that is quite interesting to look at the changing categories that exist in one place is the census. The census, as I'm sure you know, but every 10 years there's a census, and the U.S. has been quite consistent in doing that. So 2020 was the latest census. So this is a period when the government attempts to basically take an inventory of everyone who lives in the country, right? And from the very beginnings of the census, there has been a question about race on the form. However, if we look back at those earlier forms, we can see that the categories that were used to ask people about race and about racial identity have changed a lot. So these are some examples from 1880, 1890, 1910, 1930, 1940, 1950, and I'll show you the one from 2020. But you can see that the categories change a lot, both moving from a smaller number of categories to a bigger number of categories. There are some categories that have completely fallen out of the form that we don't talk about, right? Because they are based on that era. So these early ones from the sort of the late 19th century, some of those categories are precisely a reflection of the post-slavery era in the United States. And some of the more recent ones reflect a more multicultural society, but still one that was divided up or classified in different ways than some of the terms we would use today, right? This is the form from 2020, and if you take a look, and again, if you're really interested in this, it's really easy to find all the information about the census over time. So it's actually really interesting to look at how the question was posed, even at different points, because not only do the categories change, but what question is exactly asked has changed over time. So here's the 2021, and you'll notice that there is, again, a question both about race and a question about ethnicity, right? So here's a question about whether someone is of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin. And then the next question is about race. And the way that the question is phrased now is mark one or more boxes. So at least in the last couple of censuses, the form has moved from making people pick one box to recognizing that people often have multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multiracial identities. So when you're filling this out, you can pick more than one box. And then the form also asks people to provide some more information, right? So if you pick white, you can also be specific about the origins, right? The particular sort of national or regional origin. So these are the latest categories, right? And my point is not that these categories are any better than the other categories, but simply that clearly race and ethnicity are something that changes over time as social circumstances change. They are not static. They are not rooted in biology. They are rooted in our particular social understandings of who people are. To understand the ways that race is socially constructed, we can also compare across two different societies. And your book does this. I want to follow up on one of the examples that the book gives, which is the difference between the U.S. concept of hypodescent versus the way that race is understood and talked about in the country of Brazil. So as the book points out, in the United States, the cultural model of race rests on a concept that's called hypodescent. What hypodescent means is that someone who has parents with different racial identities or different racial origins, that the child of those parents will be classified with the race of the parent that is less powerful. Okay, so that's what hypodescent means. So in other words, in the U.S., someone who has one parent who is white and one parent who is African American will be classified as African American. We've got lots of examples of that. One of the most obvious ones that comes to mind was President Barack Obama, whose mom was white and dad was African. So the classification of Obama follows that cultural model in the U.S. that's called hypodescent. So again, to be clear here, this is a cultural model. This is not biology. This is not nature. This is not science. This is just the way that race is perceived and understood in the cultural context of the United States. In other cultural contexts, the way that race is perceived and understood does not follow that well, right? So the book points out that in Brazil, there isn't that rule of hypodescent. So in other words, in Brazil, the members of the same family who may have different skin tones would not all be classified or talked about as being part of the same racial group or the same racial identity, right? That people might be described as having, for example, different skin tones, right? So this Brazilian notion of tipos is one where people's appearance is a little bit more on a continuum, or there's more gradations, and it's also relative. It sort of depends. So people might be described in different ways when they're in different settings.
The U.S., there's a tendency for race to be understood as being just an essential part of identity. Like, you are this one thing, right? So again, the point here is that these are cultural models. These are particular ways of viewing this that are part of one sort of social world. There's nothing more true or less true about them. It's just the way that people perceive them, okay? And those models, those culturally specific models about identity, get built into a society through the way that people talk about stuff, right? Your book, for example, gives as an example of how ideas about race get built into U.S. society, of the example of people talking about sports ability and the assumptions about the relationship between sports ability and race, right? That over time, if enough people talk about something and come to assume something, it becomes part of what people take for granted. It becomes part of the worldview, right? So again, as anthropologists, what we're interested in doing is figuring out what are those processes by which people have created this reality, right, over time. A reality that's very powerful, right, that we come to accept as natural, as just the way things are. Actually if we look carefully, we can trace out all those social processes over time that have instilled these particular models in particular places. Okay, now we've already talked quite a bit about ethnicity, which sort of overlaps in a lot of ways with race. Ethnicity is, again, a sort of parallel set of identities that is usually premised on the idea that there is something distinctive about the cultural heritage, language, traditions, etc. of a particular group of people that gives them a distinctive identity, right? Sometimes it, again, includes elements that we might also think of as race, but it's also one of those sort of culturally constructed categories by which people both claim their own identities and apply identities to other people. In a place like the US, where we have a multitude of different ethnicities, in other diverse societies in the world besides the United States, one of the big questions that anthropologists are interested in is how people envision what that multicultural nation or society is like. And a couple of the analogies that are often used are whether something is a melting pot or a salad bowl. That probably doesn't cover all the options, but the idea is in some multicultural or diverse societies, there is a tendency to expect that people of different ethnicities will assimilate or will change to be more like the dominant culture. In others, there's more acceptance that people can maintain their ethnic distinctiveness while still being part of, again, a multicultural world. So in the United States, I think we see some of each, right? And it depends on the moment, it depends on the part of the country you're in, depends on the politics of the moment. But these are some of the dynamics around ethnicity, is how, not only sort of how people imagine who they are, but also how people are understood to fit into the world around them. Ethnicity is also very closely tied to nationality, which is the sense of belonging that people have in terms of the nation state that they're a part of. So part of this is the sort of political legal issue of citizenship, but part of it is also just the sort of sense of being part of a country or part of a nation. Again, which is an element of identity that many people feel very strongly, right? So beyond just sort of where you have a legal right to reside, people feeling a sense of connectedness to that political entity. Nationality is an issue that we will talk about a lot in the book that you guys started reading for this week. So if you're following the syllabus, you know that in addition to reading a chapter in the Perspectives book, I also had you start our ethnography that we'll be reading this semester, which is a book called Labor and Legality, which is a book by an anthropologist that is about undocumented immigrants in the U.S. And specifically, what the author is following is a group of men from Mexico who live and work in Chicago. So it's quite relevant to us living here in Chicago, I think, specifically because that's where the book takes place. But of course, it's also very relevant to us here in the U.S., where there's been a tremendous amount of debate and some very sort of troubling developments in this country around the question of immigration and particularly the status of undocumented people. So Labor and Legality follows this group of men who in the book are referred to as the Lions as they make their lives. And the author follows these men both. She collects narratives about their lives, starting from their lives in Mexico and what made them leave and how they got here, and then also traces their work here. So this group of men, most of whom work as busboys in a restaurant, relationships, all these different things. So it's a real sort of classic ethnography where the author spent extended time hanging out with these men, getting to know them, becomes friends with them. She also worked in the restaurant where they work. So you'll get a real sort of 360 view of the lives of this network of men. And I think it's a great book for thinking about the experiences of undocumented people living in the United States, and also for examining the many misconceptions and prejudices that are out there about undocumented people. The author is really good at giving us the sort of historical background and at challenging some of the assumptions about undocumented people that circulate in the media. So I hope that you will enjoy it. If you haven't already, please do start reading that book. It's very eye-opening, and she really does a great job of putting a human face, really showing the individual people and the individual lives behind a lot of those big debates about immigration in the United States. So as you read that, we'll also continue to think and talk about ethnicity and nationality, which are very central to that book.